Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Australia is considered one of the US's main allies in the English-speaking world, but the Conservative Prime Minister Tony Abbott's increasingly belligerent rhetoric on a number of policy fronts has made him an embarrassing bedfellow of the West. On top of his vehement climate denialism, Abbott has recently been criticized for the appalling treatment of imprisoned asylum seekers that are held on the Pacific islands of Nauru and Manus. Mistreatment of prisoners includes sexual abuse, rape, and physical assault. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, singled out Australia for its abuse of children asylees in particular, to which Prime Minister Abbott responded that he was, quote, sick of being lectured to. Abbott has also come under fire recently for policies and comments targeting his nation's Indigenous population. His administration has pushed severe cuts to Aboriginal legal services. Those cuts were just reversed after public outrage, but comments that Abbott made earlier in the month underscore the poor relations his government has had with Indigenous communities. Abbott claimed it was not the responsibility of taxpayers to subsidize the, quote, lifestyle choices of Aboriginal people who live on remote lands and need services. Joining me now is Dr. Binoy Kampmark. He is a senior lecturer in the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies and writes for counterpunch.org and is joining us from Australia, where it's the middle of the night. Welcome to Uprising, Dr. Binoy Kampmark, and thanks so much for waking up so late to do this interview.
It's a pleasure being with you.
Well, first let's talk about the problems with the refugees and detention. How serious is this? Can you give us a sense of how big the imprisoned population is, where they come from, and why they're held in these island facilities to begin with?
Well, yes, the population runs in the hundreds, and they're dispersed through a particular detention system that the Australian government has adopted over the years. Throughout the latter part of the 90s and then the early part of the last decade, there was a system that was developed. It was known as the Pacific Solution, as it was termed, and then it subsided somewhat, and then it was revived, and it was to deal with a particular arrival of groups of people from certain countries. They tended to come from, interestingly enough, from particular war zones that also had Australian involvement, namely Afghanistan, namely Iraq, and in some cases the southern part, in terms of Sri Lanka and so forth. So we've got a range of individuals who have sought refuge via various channels, and they have adopted a rather dangerous route, of course, of transiting through, for example, Indonesia, and then seeking a refuge in Australia. But the response of the government has been very hardline, and that is to use this detention camp system, which is something like, as I've called it, a crude gulag archipelago, as it were, if you like, dealing with these individuals.